Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Dogs Unknown. I'm Sarah Fraser, joined by fellow host Brian Burton. And good topic today, I think. For the past several decades, we'll say, dog owners have been pretty inundated with messages telling us that we need to be the pack leader or we need to be alpha with our dogs. And those specific terms are often accompanied by this expectation that we need to take a power position by maybe actively asserting dominance over our dogs in daily lives, doing things like making sure we go out the door first, maybe taking away their food bowl away or their toys when the dog's actively engaged with them, making sure we always win at games of tug, making sure a dog doesn't walk ahead of us on leash, and so many other daily activities that we've been told that kind of reaffirm for the dog their position as, for lack of a better term, a subordinate in this relationship. And so our question today is all of this really necessary? Do dogs need some form of leadership from us? And if so, what does that actually look like? What does a healthy form of that actually look like in daily life? So we're going to tackle all of these questions and more on today's episode of Dogs Unknown. And we are very happy to be joined by Ayelet Berger from Instinct Nashville. Ayelet is co-owner of Instinct Nashville and also a certified behavior consultant. And Taylor from Instinct Portland, who is also a certified behavior consultant. And I know both of these folks are going to have lots to add to the conversation today. So very excited to have you both here. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Super excited too.
Good. Yes, I know. I think we all chatted very briefly beforehand, and we're excited to have this conversation.
Yes.
It's a very important one. So first question, big picture, one word response, yes or no, but you can add your choice of punctuation after the word. Okay. So a comma, a period, a question mark, an ellipsis, doesn't matter. Do we need to assume a leadership role with our dogs for them to be healthy, happy, safe, and pleasant to live with? Taylor, you go first, and you're allowed to explain your punctuation.
Okay. I'm going to say yes.
I heard a question mark.
I'm trying to decide if, can I do the and sign? Can I do an ampersand there or a comma? Yeah, I think yes. And there's so much more than a one-word answer there, essentially.
Love it. We'll get into that and more. But so, Taylor, you are yes, comma. Ayelet, how about you?
I am a yes, ellipses.
I like that as well. A little more skeptical, maybe.
Wait, what's an ellipses?
Dot.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yes.
So with the dot
Monday
would be
morning
for because I would want to expand. It's the it depends symbol for me.
Yes. Well said. Brian?
You go ahead. I'm still thinking.
Okay. I would say yes. And I'm torn between a comma and I'm feeling a little excited this morning. So maybe an exclamation point too, but that seems a little final. So I think I'll go with the comma.
Okay. I'm going to go with the, this is so hard. Yeah, I'll go with the comma or a question mark.
Mm-hmm. I thought about that one as well.
Yeah. So, and if I had to pick one, probably the question mark, and we'll get into it. But
yeah. Okay. So I love that. So we have yeses from all of us, but I think pretty emphatically there, it's a yes, but, or yes, and yes, there's lots more to this conversation in terms of what that actually looks like and means. So, but logged leadership feels important to all of us behavior consultants on this call. So if you feel that way at home too, we're in agreement with you. Before we get into maybe what leadership looks like and doesn't look like to us, why might dogs benefit, or why do we feel like dogs benefit from us stepping into a leadership role? Why is that important? They're a different species. They're not our human kids. Why is that an important thing to provide to them? Ayelet, do you want to jump in with thoughts there? No.
It looked like Taylor was about to get in there, and I'm more than happy to.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Taylor, go right ahead.
Sure. I think for me, it's very, I almost want to bring the kid comparison in, right? In terms of just small children and dogs, in my mind, tend to make maybe questionable decisions at times that we as human adults might not approve of or might find unsafe or just unhealthy, right? And so for me, I think it's just, they might need that leadership to divert them down a slightly more happy, healthy, harmonious path.
Well said. I would agree with that.
Yeah.
I think that, yes, that role, and you touched on it, that role as dependent family members, and the reality that sometimes there is going to be some level of, for lack of a better word, almost deference required to be able to keep them safe. And I don't even know if there needs to be some degree, hopefully it's preferable to the dog if they're comfortable taking guidance from us when there's situations where we need to redirect them to a better, safer, more appropriate path, because otherwise that can feel really frustrating. And if they don't sort of view us as having some degree of like a leadership role, then it can be more like, well, why the hell are you telling me to stop like digging in the plants or trying to run out the door? So I think that dynamic can make them feel a whole lot safer and can make those boundaries feel a lot less frustrating when we come up against them.
Yeah.
Anyone have added thoughts there?
I was thinking of the child comparison as well. And I think, obviously we're specifically talking about pet dogs, and for a moment, like Streeties, Streety dogs sort of popped in mind. And I'm like, oh, they're good on their own. But, our pet dogs, I mean, we've put them in this position. So I think it would be fair to sort of like throw them in the deep end of the pool and say, all right, well, have fun. Right. So having that sort of guidance, which is how I think also, how do we each view leadership? That's a whole can of worms. Right. But for me, it's guidance and cooperation.
I absolutely love that you brought up the note about sort of the street dogs or other canids, because I think that's really important to drive home the point that sometimes, we as dog owners are told like, oh, well, your dog wants a leader. They crave a leader, like they're going to seek that out or take that role on themselves sort of thing. And I think you touched on something really important there, that it's not something inherent about the dog that is going to seek out and say, I'm going to find me a human. Like if I'm in the middle of the woods, I'm going to set out on a trek and find me a human to lead the way. It's the circumstance. It's the dog and the human and the environment in which we're living in. It's the pet dog circumstance where it is this like closed environment and family unit where they need that guidance. So I love that you touched on that point, because I think it's a really important one that gets lost sometimes in this conversation.
Yeah, it does. Because I think one of the risks with this too is like, we don't really know how dogs perceive these relationships. Like we don't know if they're actually perceiving a leader, or are we describing like a set of behaviors that we do to shepherd them through the world, safely. And so they can have, it can be healthy and thrive in our world. And I think that's why I had the question mark. Mm-hmm. Because I don't really know how they perceive it. And I have thoughts about it. Do I think some dogs sort of perceive it that way? Yeah, it feels that way. Or have I worked with other dogs that I don't really know if it feels that way to them, but we can still help them feel safe, and we can still be a source of comfort or a source of guidance, like you both said. And so I think for me, that's where the question mark comes from. I think we have to be really careful about how are they perceiving that. Because I agree with you. Like, I don't know if they're going out like looking for a leader, and I do think that's, for really getting into the weeds, I think that's a place we have to be careful. Mm-hmm. But they sure as hell need a shepherd in our human world, and to navigate the environments that they are in. So I think, and I think that is a necessity for them to be safe and happy and healthy. In our society or in our culture. And I know we're talking today, and this is largely a North American or Western type podcast. And I know if you talk to people different areas of the world, that can be seen differently too. So we always have to be aware of sort of our cultural lens as well, and making sure that we're not, forcing that onto the dog. So
part of my ellipses is in that, and also, if we have a working dog who might also be a pet dog, but, how much leadership ultimately will I need to give to a dog who has a very specific job? And there is obviously that cooperation, but, there are some dogs who, we send out and they're like, I got this, I'm good, and then they come back, or whatever their job might be. So anyway, that's where my ellipses comes in.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that hits on to the original question was how might dogs benefit from us stepping into a leadership role? And I think the other thing that's important to say here is some dogs will benefit a lot more than others. Like if you have a dog who's maybe fearful or anxious or, easily frustrated by changes or lack of predictability,
Yep.
or you have a puppy who's figuring out the world, leadership then to my mind becomes or the amount of guidance that dog is comfortable taking or seeking out is really important. Whereas if you have another dog who's like totally happy-go-lucky, go with the flow, and you sort of are just like coexisting together and you make suggestions and they're like, well, that sounds amazing, let's do it, then leadership may not be that big of a thing, really.
Right.
So I think it depends on the individual dog as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we've probably all seen, like, there have been dogs that I've worked with, and I think in this case, it's usually not behavioral type stuff. It's just sort of maybe like some nuisance stuff or different things going on. And there really wasn't a whole lot of structure or guidance or things happening. But by and large, the dog was doing totally fine. And I think I really think that's like an important point, is that I think that is going to be very dog specific, though I do think the vast majority of dogs are going to benefit from that.
Yeah, from some degree of
yeah,
sort of predictability and structure and guidance. It's just how much, I think, can vary a lot by dog.
Yep. And it also can make the dog and the relationship less resilient to changes in the future as well. Because like, if health issues pop up or you have a change in environment or something scary happens or the pandemic happens, like those types of things, if that leadership isn't there, sometimes like changes can actually impact those dogs more. Whereas I think dogs who have a strong relationship with their owner, by and large, tend to be a little bit more resilient to change and things that might, pop up and cause stress or whatever in the future.
Yeah, I really like that point. I think it's a really valid point. If you have one of those sort of like easy breezy, happy-go-lucky dogs, it doesn't mean it's not still a good idea.
Correct.
To seek out maybe that type of dynamic to insulate them against potential future like changes or challenges.
Yeah.
I love that. Good. Any final thoughts there on benefits to dogs of us stepping into a leadership role? I think we covered them nicely, but before we move along, I feel like we're good. Okay. So, at the top of the episode, we sort of set this up saying that we've been told as dog owners for quite some time now how important it is to be terms like the pack leader or the alpha and taking on that type of mentality, sort of that real power dynamic with regards to leadership. What are your thoughts on that in terms of the relationship dynamic that it fosters in dogs? Is that problematic? Is it something you agree with? Does it have a question mark with it as well? I don't know who wants to tackle this one first, because I know it's a big question, but I would love to hear your thoughts before I chime in.
I'm going to go for it.
Go for it.
I think that, as always, it depends on the person. As we say, it depends on the dog. I think that what observable behaviors the person is displaying with that job in mind of being the pack leader, for example, I think that's so much more important. If a person hears pack leader and perhaps they start adhering to rules that they don't actually want to adhere to, or they kind of feel icky about, right? To use your term, Sarah, then it's not beneficial. I think it can at times fracture a relationship or a bond. If someone really wants to, let's say, something that I think is pretty common that I hear is that I was told that I can't have my dog sleep in bed with me. And they really miss that. Maybe they had the dog in bed with them, and then someone told them, well, you have to be the pack leader, and therefore your dog can no longer sleep in bed with you. And that can be really upsetting to people. So I think for their, like, when we get a dog, we want that companionship, and some people really enjoy that, having that cuddle buddy. And so if they hear, I am the pack leader, and therefore I can't engage in activities with my dog that actually brings us closer together and makes my dog more cooperative, then I do think it's detrimental. If you say, I need to be the pack leader, and what that means to me is I want to make sure that their welfare is taken care of. I want to make sure that I give them the right exercise. I want to make sure that I'm really researching the food I'm giving them and it's appropriate, right? Then it's like, fantastic. Call it what you will. So that's my stance on that.
I really like how you called out there just the importance of defining the label. I think I'll save my response, but I think the danger sometimes with these terms is the mentality that often comes along with it.
Yep.
That's sort of baked in there. And it's not a rule. There are exceptions to your point of someone, how they may view that term. But I think that, yeah, there's certain sort of preconceived notions or conceptions about what that dynamic actually looks like when we use those terms. Taylor, do you want to chime in with thoughts there?
Sure. I mean, I think that was a really, really wonderful summary to start with, honestly. I'll just kind of tack on there that for me, it really, when I hear I'm talking to a client or I'm talking to a family member, right? And they're saying, "Oh, I want to be the pack leader." It's really just what emotion are you feeling there, right? Like, are you excited about that? Is that fun for you? Is it fun for the dog and you? Just, I think that really matters of what does that elicit for you? Not just our strict definition of like, here's my bullet points, which absolutely matters too, but like, how does that make you feel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I have thoughts. I have additional thoughts as well. But Brian, did you want to?
You can go first.
Want to hop in? Yeah, I think for me, where my guard goes up a bit with these specific terms. I mean, in part is how they became kind of popularized, and I think that it's sort of they are often, not always, but often built on this premise that you gain respect through being almost like a threat in your dog's environment, and that. To your point about the sleeping in the bed, Ayala, you maintain it by not showing any sort of perceived weakness, with things like allowing sleeping in the bed or certain things like that. And I think there's a big focus with these terms on getting compliance rather than fostering like cooperation or providing guidance. So I think that's where I struggle with those a little bit, and my guard goes up. Is it seems that there's this built-in notion of it's a position that you assume by force, and I don't mean by like necessarily anything extreme like brute force, but by some sort of force that like you have to take this position or your dog will take it,
right?
Right. And so I think that's where just being careful about, there may be different terms we could use that might just fit better for the dynamic that most people seem to be seeking in our experience when it comes to life with their dog.
Yeah. A number of years ago, if I saw someone like in a consult form and they made a reference like, hey, I want to be a good pack leader, or I think I'm a good pack leader, kind of like what you said, my guard would go up a little bit. I will say at this point, when I see that, I just wait to get there and just inquire a bit more, because I think the thing is I've seen people use that term and they were doing everything just lovely. Like,
absolutely.
And it was like little tweaks here and there, and they weren't sort of taking that sort of more traditional pack leader approach. And then there have been other times where, I think, I can't remember if Taylor or Ayala said, but sort of like that, they were kind of doing it because they felt like they had to. And that was like the right thing to do. And that's what being a good dog owner meant, because of what they saw on TV or what they're seeing on social media. And because it's very, and honestly, like I don't even know if I can think of one off the top of my head. I think in all of those cases, it's either sort of like they're using the term differently, or they didn't really want to do that. And so I always like to ask people sort of, leadership's great. We want to have leadership for a dog. I'm on the same page. So like, let's talk through, what does that mean to you? And hearing that. And a lot of times when you get into it, I do think people are like, they want to be able to give their dog direction, or they want to help them feel safe, or they want to help them do all of that. So if that's the case, then I don't get really stuck on the term. I will generally say, like, we think about leadership, about being safe, helpful, and predictable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And maybe just kind of steer them towards like, we're going to use like leadership, but I don't get too much into like not using that term, or let's not use that term. I'm just going to like use the language that I think is probably a little bit more accurate, and not going to make a big deal about that. The other place where, alpha and pack leader and those terms can come up is around the concept of dominance. And there's definitely, TV personalities or social media people that talk about dominance and how important it is to be dominant over your dog. And if not, they're they're going to have behavior issues, they're going to be a safety risk, and all of these things. And where this is really tricky, although I do actually enjoy talking about this, is dominance is absolutely a very real thing. Like it's studied in animal behavior programs, it's studied in ethology. There's a rich literature on dominance, various definitions, but for the sake of today, sort of like that, priority access to resources, we could get into, I know there's others that, is it a collection of traits? And regardless, it is a real thing. But what it isn't is this isn't like, I need to be dominant over my dog so they defer everything and all things to me at all times.
No matter what.
Like that's not really what it is. So if we take like the term that's probably most applicable to pet dogs, which is like priority access to a resource. Because if people are concerned about that, I can be like, yeah, I can see that. Like if there's like a chicken bone on the ground or there's something dangerous and you go up to it and your dog wants it and I want it, I need a way to be able to get that item. But I think what got lost in sort of where dog training went completely off the rails was that has to be done through conflict, right? And there's all kinds of ways that if we need access to a couch or we need access to different things, we can teach that in a way that's much more cooperative, that's much more like that we're not using conflict to get there. And I actually enjoy having those conversations because because honestly, I'll say to people like, hey, like this is a totally valid conversation to have, but how we choose to gain access to those resources that we need to is going to look completely different than what you're probably thinking right now. And it's going to be a lot more fun and less risky. And you don't have to walk around thinking like, just because my dog got the toy this time, that now all of a sudden, everything else is all going to fall apart, because that actual definition of dominance is very fluid and it's dependent on a whole bunch of different things. So I did want to bring that up because one of my concerns sometimes in our industry is we try to sweep that term under the rug and just pretend like it doesn't exist. And I do think it makes us sound like we're not being realistic sometimes. And again, it's not like advertising, oh, we're going to help you be dominant with, over your dog because we're going to teach ways to be able to safely get like a toy off of them. But also at the same time, if it comes up, I think we have to have that actual real conversation. And that's the one where I find can be a little bit more problematic even than like pack leader and those other things is if people feel like they really have to do that in order for their dog to be safe or whatever. So I know it's a bit of a ramble, but.
No, I love that you brought that up. I think it's something that everyone thinks about. And I think it's, again, acknowledging that it's a real construct that, has been pretty deeply studied is really important. And I think one thing that you touched on there that will lead us nicely into the next part of this conversation is it's not that the potential need to, say, be able to access your couch when you need to, or be able to access something unsafe that your dog has when you need to, isn't important. It absolutely is important. It's so important when we're responsible for the safety and well-being of, the dog in our lives, and also just being able to have a peaceful life ourselves with the dog in our home. Is that I think that gets us into like, what's the actual type of leadership we're striving for?
Right.
Is it the kind that we take? Or is it the kind that we want to earn that's like given to us by the dog?
Right.
Right. Like that's real leadership. It isn't like taking a position of power. It's conducting yourself in a way where your dog or whoever else is around you is saying like, you seem like you have good ideas. You seem like you know what's going on. I'm going to look to you for guidance in these situations. I'm going to trust the advice or the guidance that you're giving to me because you've proven to me that you seem like you have worthwhile ideas and you go about it in a way that's like kind and safe and predictable. So yeah, I really love that it's like, it's not sweeping the idea of dominance under the rug. It's saying that the type of leadership, the way that we get there in terms of being able to provide guidance is something that we want to earn.
Right.
It's something that we want our dogs to give to us versus something that we try to take through conflict. Yeah. And that, in my opinion, that leads to leadership that's a whole lot more stable.
Way more.
In all species, right? If you are conducting yourself in a way where someone bestows the leadership role upon you versus you taking it by force, you're probably in a much better position for a whole lot longer period of time with one versus the other.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm not an expert at all in, this type. When we did our graduate degree, we were exposed to some of these ideas. But I think that point is really important. Like, whatever species there is, if there's a social group, the ones that are stable, it tends to be more like leadership like that. Like the ones that are built on conflict, just tend to be more unstable, more dangerous, as well. And, so I think, I just think that's a really important point, because like there is actually, some nice literature on there too, in terms of like, structures of social groups and everything. And if there is leadership, like how that leadership is obtained and how it's maintained. And generally when there's lower conflict, it's going to be much more stable. And when it's like mutually beneficial, it's going to be much more stable, because otherwise, why are you going to put up with that? I mean, I think us as humans, we understand that, right now. But yeah, so.
Yeah. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So we sort of started to get into it anyway, but what does healthy leadership look like to each of you? If someone, comes to you and says like, hey, I really want to develop this dynamic where I'm a good leader to my dog, like, what does that involve? What does that look like? Both maybe broadly, and then when we get into really in day-to-day life.
Yeah, I almost want to tack on to the grad school thing there briefly, just to say that in my undergrad, I actually have a certificate in leadership studies, just by chance, which is human related specifically, not cross species, but there's a lot of kind of theories and structures that philosophically have been put behind this idea of leadership and how we create groups and leaders and all of that sort of thing. And all of this conversation is really just making me think about a specific model of leadership called the servant leadership model, where it's really about what are you giving to the group? How are you supporting the group and yourself in turn? And for me, I think that kind of starts to answer the question you've just asked, Sarah, in terms of how do we make leadership look right for us and our dogs. And for me, in my own home, which has 3 dogs in it currently, of a variety of ages and sizes and things, it really looks like, how am I giving back to this family I've created, right? How am I making sure that I support my 2 younger athletic, drivey dogs in their needs without, honestly angering my 13-year-old lady? How is that leadership? And often that means, okay, well, maybe we're going a little bit separately on a given day. Maybe we're acknowledging that the needs of the older dog look like chewing and sniffing the grass and not running on the treadmill, for example, and guiding them in that direction instead of just letting them all sit in a room together and make each other mad, honestly. So really being able to say like, hey, I'm helping you by doing this. Let's all kind of get on board is what that kind of looks like for me, to give a more specific example, I think.
Yeah, that's I appreciate you bringing that up. And I love the note back to it. Again, I think it strikes home to this point. We don't really know how dogs perceive it, but some of those like human-based models of leadership, I do think we can at least pull in some of those principles, because we are both social species. And I know we have to be careful about how we're assuming dogs perceive things, but I love that you brought up that note.
There's going to be some overlap.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Ayelet, how about you? What does healthy leadership look like?
I think in 2 different hats, right, that I wear. One is leading a team of trainers, and one is leading a family, like children and all of the rest of that. And so part of it is understanding, helping guide decisions for the greater good and for the health of the unit. So the model, if I'm looking at it like a leader within a company, let's say, right? So you can certainly be that leader who's like, this is what I need it now, and that's it. And I don't care about anything else. And then there's also the leader who is more cooperative and understands that their role, to your point, Taylor, is to support and assist the entire unit. And they can see big picture. And so their goals are to make sure that the decisions that are being made by them or that they are leading others to is in support of the entire unit. And in that unit, it could be you and your dog, right? But it could be your dog within their community, within their neighborhood, what have you. And so being able to take that mental load responsibility on, I think, is a really important part of leadership with our dogs and elsewhere.
Yeah. Brian, what are your thoughts?
What does leadership look like?
Yeah. What does healthy leadership look like between humans and dogs?
Yeah. Well, I mean, definitely agree with Taylor and Ayala and what they said in terms of, because again, like what that leadership is going to look like is going to be different for every dog. And I think that's one of the things that I got out of that. And the other thing I got out of that, which I also wanted to touch on, is especially if you're sort of leading a family group with multiple dogs or even one dog, but like multiple dogs or multiple family members, being able to, you're going to have to make decisions sometimes that is going to be hard for maybe one or other members like in that particular group, but being able to make those decisions for like the health of the group or the health of what we need to do. But specifically like with dogs, I know we always talk about our definition of leadership as being safe, helpful, and predictable. And I go back to that all the time, because being safe means like how you respond to things, you are responding in a safe manner. And what I will say about that one is, if you're only safe 98% of the time, that 2% of the time is going to poison. It's going to cause a lot of anxiety for a lot of dogs or a lot of people. So being safe, I think, is one of the most important things.
And I think I want to clarify for people, that doesn't mean you successfully create a world where your dog always feels safe.
Right.
It's that to your dog, you are safe.
Right. You are safe.
You are not a threat to them.
Right. You are not a threat. And I really, the impact of that sometimes can't be seen for years, like months or years, because it's sort of like this chronic anxiety that can almost happen, where it's like, I don't really know how you're going to respond. And that's the predictable part, but they're a little bit tied up for me. Like I'm going to respond in a predictable manner, and then helpful, obviously giving guidance and doing things that we need to do. So I think those three things are really important. The other thing, though, I think sort of in with this is, I do find it helpful with quite a few clients when, say, they have a new puppy or they got a new dog, or it's sort of new, or they maybe they've had dogs in the past and they have a dog where maybe it's just a little bit more challenging to sort of establish a relationship with them or do these things. Is one of my favorite things to do is like, what are 3 boundaries that you have with your dog? And they can be anything. It doesn't matter. It can just be, you're not in the kitchen when I'm making food. I don't want them in the kitchen. Or it can be, before we go out the door, you're always going to sit, or maybe you're not allowed up on this one specific chair. I do find sometimes it's really nice, especially if people aren't naturally inclined to sort of set up those boundaries, to pick something, because I do think there's something in that relationship where it communicates, hey, I do have these boundaries. I am going to, be safe, helpful, and predictable. I'm going to respond in the same manner every time. I'm also going to teach you what I want you to do instead and reinforce those and everything. I have found that sometimes there are times where if we don't have some clear boundaries, regardless of what they are, I do find it can make other aspects where we need to sort of give them guidance and do things a little bit more difficult. And of course, this isn't every dog or every owner, but I do like to ask that question, because if I ask that question, like what are 3 boundaries you have with your dog, and the answer is none, that might be okay. But usually if I'm there's usually other things going on. So we pick a few different things, because I think you need practice to set boundaries. I do think boundary setting and how you respond to it is a really important part of that leadership. And you need a way to be able to practice this in a way that's like safe, and also for you where it's like maybe a little bit easier to execute because you have a game plan and those types of things for it. So I would say for me, I find that really important, mixed in with the safe, helpful, and predictable part.
Well, and I would almost say that I feel like that speaks to the predictable part of it. And maybe that rises to the top when someone has a hard time being predictable.
Yes.
Like sometimes you're allowed on the couch, sometimes you're not. Right. Sometimes you're allowed to jump up, sometimes you're not. Sometimes you're allowed in the kitchen, but not when I'm cooking X, or not when like there's other people in the kitchen too. And I feel like maybe in those situations where that recommendation is rising to the top for you, it's someone who maybe does have a hard time or who isn't naturally super predictable about boundaries. I'm not saying that's always the case, but I would say that if it would certainly raise the level of predictability.
Yes.
With between the person and the dog. And I know there's something else there too, just in terms of the dog maybe being thoughtful about their environment
I think that's it. Yeah.
in different ways, that's layered in there as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, I like that point. And I think for me, obviously safe, predictable, and helpful is huge. I think the leadership piece for me, the helpful part of it really comes into play. And I know, Taylor, you mentioned this with the whole sort of the servant model, and Ayala talking about how did the decisions impact everyone. I feel like that helpful piece, how do you show up and be a helpful person in your dog's life, is really important. And I think even within that, how are you helpful in situations where they might be uncomfortable or things that they might find scary or threatening? Because I think we've probably all had leaders in our lives who are really great when things are going well. But I think the test of a real leader is like, what happens when something goes wrong? What happens when things are tough? What happens when things are difficult? How do they show up for you? And I think that holds true with our dogs as well. So I think one of the huge ones for me in that helpful aspect is, how do you provide your dog with guidance and support when they're faced with something that's uncomfortable or scary, right? Like, how do you step in and advocate for them or protect them and kind of take on that role? Like that, for me, that protector role is such an important part of leadership. Knowing that sometimes it's not that we want to regularly be putting our dogs in situations that feel that way, but I mean, the reality of living in our human world is there are going to be times where they find things scary or threatening or whatnot. So I think that's a big one. And that can be as simple for people listening as like, I create more distance for my dog.
Right.
Like we walk away and I create more space. It can mean like, I'm going to step up and take sort of we call it the protector position at Instinct, but like, I'm going to step up and sort of use my body to actually be a buffer from you and the scary thing if we can't move away, right? Like it doesn't have to be huge things, but they can communicate so much to our dogs in terms of who we are in relation to their environment and what we're going to do to help keep them safe.
And I just want to add to that. I love that because like, I love the fact that you bring that up because I agree with you 100%. That's so important. And it's almost like with leadership with the dog, it's almost like, I think in my head, I almost envision like there's sort of like how we as a group sort of deal with like the outside world and the environment and things that come into it and how I'm going to help you, navigate that and everything. And then there's also the dynamics like sort of like within the group as well. And I find like if you're just setting boundaries, but not being a protector or being their advocate when you're out in the world, like you're going to have some gaps in your leadership style. And I think the reason why I brought this up is I've seen it the other way too, where it's like, hey, like people are very helpful, very thoughtful that how they're helping their dog out in the world, but like internally within their relationship, there are things that have to be worked on there in terms of like boundary setting and everything. So, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I've thought about it this specifically, but it almost feels like there's two pieces to it. It's like how we're dealing as a group with the outside world and how I'm helping you with that. But then also what are those dynamics within our relationship to be able to move forward and for them to have the confidence that you're able to, make good decisions and do these things. So yeah, just thought that was interesting. I haven't really thought about it that way, but I kind of like that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it's a helpful way to think about things.
Yeah,
for sure.
For sure. Yeah, it makes me also, kind of loop all the way back with, I believe, Taylor, when you were saying, how does it make you feel when you hear the word, like when you say I'm the pack leader, right? What emotions does that evoke in you? And then I'm thinking, Sarah, to you saying, I'm going to show up for you when things are tough and scary. And so when the two marry, and like all I'm thinking about currently is like a dog who's afraid of thunder, right? For example. And so how do you show up for a fearful dog in that situation if the mentality is I'm going to be alpha or pack leader and what that invokes in you? And does that look like a comforting person, or does it look like a person who is telling or showing the dog tough it out? Does that make sense? Like sort of where I'm going with that. it's interesting to think about how do we show up for them when things are tough, and how does that label that we've taken on influence those decisions of how to show up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I really like that point a lot. Because like even in, like with that example with the thunderstorm, like, yeah, like you could be like, well, I'm going to be the pack leader. So I'm going to sit next to you or keep you on a leash and stand next to you. And I'm going to be confident. That might not be what they need. And there are some dogs where if you sit next to them and comfort them and just sort of be a calm presence, like that's, for some dogs, that's good enough, but that might not be what your dog actually needs. They might need you to do something else. And again, I think that's sort of that more traditional pack leader, definition, but yeah. It's a good point.
Yeah. And I think sometimes we can be at the risk with that traditional term, and this may be taking it a step too far, but can focus a lot on like what are the external behaviors that the dog or animal is showing. So if you're having trouble in a thunderstorm, you're not allowed to pace. You're not allowed to bark.
Right.
Right. I need to get control and have you sort of weather this. That's a terrible pun. I'm sorry, everybody.
Did you try that?
No.
Okay. Well, that's good. Well,
I apologize.
Well, as long as you didn't try.
I did not.
Okay.
But I think so. It can kind of, I think that's sort of what you're touching on almost, Ayelet, is like, if there can be this focus more on like external behaviors and how is the dog behaving versus like, how are they feeling and how do I help them through this? Yeah. Which involves how are they behaving as well externally, but it's also like, how do they feel?
Yeah.
And how are they managing this?
Well, you know what's funny about that too? Like, I think as a new parent, like one of the things that really grates me with like when there's like a really small kid and they're like, oh, they're so well behaved. It really bothers me because, and it's not that we don't want, like, again, we don't want chaos, right? We don't want our dogs just running around and pacing and doing all these things, but that focus on like, they're suitable to society or they're suitable to, that behavior suitable to other people, like, especially when we're dealing with like kids or animals, like using that as the measure, we have to be so careful with, because like it says it can say very little about what's going on internally. Right. And some dogs and some kids can really mask how they're feeling on the inside. And like that extreme focus on behavior, the outward behavior, is really dangerous. And I do think that's where some of that pack leader and those things makes that, it's like a focus on just that and how that behavior impacts everyone else around them or how it looks to everyone.
Yeah. Well, because I think it's sort of like, oh, they're so well behaved could mean, wow, they're so relaxed and comfortable here. Like, look how like comfy they are just sort of hanging out and being here. Or it could mean like, wow, they're really overwhelmed and worried that they're going to get in trouble.
Yep.
So they're not doing anything. And if we only use the well-behaved label, we can almost end up not caring.
Yeah.
But at the very least, we're not acknowledging that there's a difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes me think of, asking the question, whose problem are we trying to solve? Are we trying to solve the human's problem, which is be quiet under any like just be quiet. I don't care how I get there. Right. Or why are you barking? Are you anxious? How do I address the anxiety for you, the dog? And so that for me kind of ties into all of that. Whose problem are we trying to solve?
Yeah. And where the magic happens is when you can like make both happen.
Exactly.
Yes.
Right. Like I think
how
that's
do we
the
get
thing.
Both people?
How do we get both people? Because I think that's the thing too is, and sometimes I think for those on us on the positive reinforcement side, I think sometimes as a whole, I'm not talking about anyone on this call or anyone I'm thinking, but like generally as an industry, it's like, we're only concerned about like the dog and how they're feeling and everything. And there seems to be like, we're putting the human needs on the back burner.
Yeah. There's almost judgment about like, how dare you think about your own needs?
Right. Yeah. But there's lots of positive reinforcement trainers and everything that really like our goal is we want to get you to where it's good for you too. But we also want to do it so it's good for your dog. Right. And it's just not, we get you happy and then your dog is just sort of saddled with the burden of, whatever behaviors that we deem acceptable, regardless of how it's making them feel. But if we can get them to the same place where, hey, they're not pacing anymore, they're not barking, it's not annoying anymore, and they're not pacing and barking because they feel more comfortable. Plus, that's going to be a lot more stable in the long run,
right?
As well. I think that's the other key piece of that with that type of leadership is when you get there, that tends to be much more stable, and you're not micromanaging them, right? Like if you're going to the point where you're just like trying to get these behaviors there's a lot of micromanaging you're doing for potentially forever as well.
Absolutely. This whole answer to this specific question of like, what does good leadership look like for our dogs is really reminding me of a metaphor I used to use a lot when I taught more group classes, which is with my dogs, I want to be a benevolent puppeteer of like, I want to take good care of my dogs as they are. I want to shine and polish and all those good things. And I want to, and maybe need to have some control of those strings, right? But when you think about a puppet show, which maybe I'm dating myself here, right? But when you think about a puppet show, you don't want to see the strings necessarily. And so thinking about like, I want to really have it be this like beneficial for everyone relationship, but maybe I do need to pull a string now and then, right? Maybe that is, I need to cue a behavior, or I need to walk away with you from this thing that is really hard from you in public and prompt that. But just acknowledging that like there is a leadership component there for sure, but there's also a care component that we're talking about a lot, and a what does this look like from the inside and the outside of the relationship component. And it just all really brings me back to that benevolent puppeteer, which maybe sounds a little funky, but it's the way I think about it a lot of the time.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that. I definitely identify with the benevolent piece. I will be honest, the puppeteer piece for me, Taylor, like I don't identify. I get the analogy. I would almost feel like the puppeteer, like maybe the strings are attached to the environment and versus sort of the dog. And I'm not saying right or that's why I love having these conversations, because we're all going to have kind of different
things are going to land with different people.
100%. I think so for me, I totally identify with the benevolent piece. And I also like the idea of, sometimes we need to step in and make certain things happen, which to your point is the analogy of like pulling the string, So I just love hearing sort of the different terms and how they land with people. Because for me, puppeteer, I'm like,
it makes me think of like this fun puppet show with all these props. And like, maybe it is the prop I'm pulling the string on. Absolutely. But it just evokes for me, obviously, a bit of a different idea than for you, of just like this really beautiful, cool picture of a what the world looks like, right? On a stage, so to speak. So
no, I love it. Like I love hearing those different analogies.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's also important too, because even I think what's challenging about this is like there's no like true like accepted definition of like leadership.
Well, no, I mean, if you Google it, there's like, what are the 7 different kinds of leadership, and what are the 14 different models of leadership, and
and then what's leadership with like chimps versus bonobos versus elephants versus cetaceans, like whatever. Like it's so complicated, and it's interesting too, because I do think that goes back to again asking people like what they're hoping to get out of like what they think about a leadership position, or Taylor mentioned like, how do you feel about this? And then sort of gathering that information, because this is very much like it's a unique journey for a lot of people. Like, you know what I mean? Like how you frame it and how you think about it could be drastically different than someone else, even though you're basically doing the same thing. But, sort of being able, like from our position, being able to listen to people and seeing like, hey, what messaging or framing is going to resonate with you to sort of get these points across. Yeah. And I honestly feel like this is one of the areas that I feel like is a real art in what we do, is being able to pick the analogy, whether it's the benevolent puppeteer, is that it? Yeah. Or whatever other term that we want to use that's that's appropriate, but it might be slightly different for everyone. And this is one area where like how I navigate these conversations is going to be very much with the person in front of me and what's going to help them feel good about how they're moving forward. And that language might be slightly different.
Yeah. Well, and maybe that circles back as well. The thing I love about that for me is like, if like Taylor, if that makes you feel a certain way and makes you conduct yourself that way,
right?
That's what you should call yourself.
Right.
And quite honestly, if someone truly in their heart of hearts, like pack leader to them is everything we just talked about, like, and it makes them get into that mindset of like, I'm going to show up for you. I'm going to keep you safe. It's my job as like the leader of this. Have at it.
Yeah.
truly
Yeah.
have at it.
Yeah.
I think it's just, if it's really making sure and exploring like what emotions does it evoke, what does it bring to mind in terms of our responsibilities and what we need to do. So I think that's actually a really cool sort of wrap around to the original conversation.
Something you just said really struck me, Brian, about, and I'm struggling to pull the exact quote to my brain just now, but it made me think leadership can be really lonely, right? This idea of like being the person in charge, however that might look, of the things. It makes me think about how we talk about how being a new parent can be really lonely, or having a very reactive dog can be very isolating at times, right? And it just really makes me think of how important what instinct, for example, does in trying to build the community within everyone that we kind of touch. And podcasts like this one really can be in terms of saying like, hey, everybody might be thinking this in one way or another. Maybe we should all connect on it. And that was just struck me as very exciting and poignant in terms of it can be lonely out here sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. I really like that. I appreciate that, Taylor. And I think it leads me to a next thought that I think we can probably wrap up on, which is it can feel lonely. And it also, I also want everyone to hear that your dog having certain struggles behavior-wise does not mean you're not being a good leader. Right? Like we cannot under any circumstances be under this impression that we have the power to completely dictate and control how another being is going to behave and respond to the world. Leadership is such an important component of helping our dogs navigate the world feeling safe and peaceful. But holy cow, like we're not the be all end all. And it's so like, I also want people to not hear like, oh, well, I must be doing something wrong because my dog has an issue with X. Like, nope, not in any way, shape, or form. Your dog is a whole being. There's biology, there's individual traits, there's past life experiences that are all playing into their behavior. This leadership discussion is more just about like, how do we help them through it the best way we can? How do we have the most beneficial influence we can? Yeah. Knowing there's lots of other factors at play.
Yeah. Well, it's sort of like I find a lot of times when this topic of leadership comes up, it's not necessarily you're doing anything wrong, but you might have to do something different for the dog in front of you, and to expect every dog owner to know all the different ways you have to adjust a leadership style to help them through fear, aggression, or anxiety issues or whatever they're working through is just, it's bizarre. So if you're in that position, because I think there's two pieces. One is it's definitely not you're not going to override genetics and everything just based on, leadership alone. However, if you do need to make some adjustments in that leadership style and you get someone who does have quite a bit of experience in the issue you're dealing with or the breed you're dealing with or whatever, those tweaks, and sometimes they're not very big, make a massive difference. And so I want people also to feel empowered that slight adjustments to how you're approaching leadership with your dog can have a very big impact, but that doesn't mean anyone should expect you to know what those are. Right? Because otherwise none of us have a job. And I can tell you from, the thousands of dogs we train, it takes a lot of experience to know like what you have to tweak and based on the environment, what's going on with everything else. So I want people to feel empowered about that, but also not feel guilty if they feel like they're struggling a little bit.
Good. Well, I really enjoyed this conversation. I hope other people found it enjoyable as well, because I think, leadership is just something that most of us think about or have thought about if we're sharing our lives with dogs, because we've been either confronted with it in different forms, or we just feel in our bones that it's something that's important as a social species living with another social species. So thank you both for joining, and